So, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming along. I know it's been a long couple of days, and this is my first time to do this presentation. I didn't get a chance to do it in San Francisco, so it's new for London, and I don't present very often, so I have put these feedback forms around, and I'd appreciate it would help me anyway, at least to hopefully improve both my presentation style and also maybe the way I develop the presentations. If you do get a chance to fill it out and drop it off, that'd be great. Very helpful. Thank you. So as I mentioned here, we're going to try and talk about a deep dive into the Alfresco core repository, and a fairly small audience. Hopefully you can see at the back, but I've put a little subtitle there. Also look at how you might embed parts of the repository in possibly a microservice style architecture. I've put a picture up here. I don't know if you know, this is Felix Baumgartner, I think that's pronounced right. He did one of the deepest dives I could find, which was a couple of years ago. He jumped from a helium balloon in the stratosphere from, I think, something like 120,000 feet, which is about 40 kilometers, almost 25 miles. So I put him up there. So a quick introduction. My name is Vonka. I'm Senior Software Engineer at Alfresco. I presented a couple of a few DevCons and summits before. I've been with Alfresco for over 7 years, and I've mostly worked on the core repository and services around the repository, and more recently on some of the cloud services, hybrid sync, and other parts of the platform. I enjoy flying hot air balloons, which was another reason I chose Felix, because he went up in a balloon, and that's a picture of my balloon. So that's something I do when I'm not at work. Now, as part of the deep dive into the core repository, there's a bit of a challenge because we're limited on time. 40 minutes is not very long, and I'd like to leave a few minutes at the end, if possible, for questions and answers or a little bit of a discussion if anybody's interested. But obviously, if I've skimmed over anything, there's a challenge here as to how we can go in deep without losing lots of things that other various people might be interested in. If there are any questions that you think might be useful to everybody, then feel free to ask them as we go along. But otherwise, just because we're a little bit short on time, we can always have a discussion afterwards if we're interested. So I'm going to try and give an overview of the repository architecture, dive in a bit deeper, all the way down to the database and the tables. And if there's time, also give a little bit of a twist on that and talk about, very briefly, microservices as a style of architecture, some of the benefits and drawbacks, and also how we've been evolving and looking at some ideas of how putting that into a so-called smart process app or intelligent process app, and giving a little bit of an example at the end. So I realize there's quite a few topics to get through. Apologies if I skim a few things and as I dive in, maybe lose some detail as we go down, but let's just see how we get on. So just a quick slide of, hopefully most of you are aware of Alfresco. I found lots of words that began with the letter C. The big ones, content, context in particular, metadata, things like customizing, because we're talking about diving into the internals, so I'm guessing that quite a few are interested in customizing and potentially configuring. So I won't go into a lot of the details of these, but we've talked about, I've heard the word control over the last couple of days, connecting in terms of syncing, etc., collaborating, so social service, some of the social aspects of Alfresco. So there's lots of services that support these areas. So one of the things is why might you be interested in diving in deeper into the repository architecture and into the source code if you haven't already? I don't know what level people are at. And the thing is, when we originally designed Alfresco, it wasn't necessarily to limit people to how they might use different parts of Alfresco. So it's got a wide, what did Brian call it earlier, a great big surface area of potential uses and applications. For some people, it may be just actually to start with, it makes sense just to use Alfresco out of the box using share and some of the protocols out of the box, maybe with a little bit of configuration, and then maybe integrating that Alfresco with other enterprise systems. But beyond that, then people typically work with our partners and maybe Alfresco consultants to extend and then further customize the Alfresco solution in both share, for example, or the repository itself. And if you want to go even further, if you're very advanced, you might actually want to take pieces of the Alfresco architecture and kind of start splitting it up a little bit and using parts of it. And I know people are interested in modularization. There's some discussions going on right now about things like OSGI and how to use various modular aspects of Alfresco. So, and then there's the option to embed parts of Alfresco in a wider solution potentially. And the other reason you might want to dive in, obviously, is people want to gain a deeper understanding how the internals work, and potentially to develop a test, troubleshoot, contribute back, and look at some of the functionality, and potentially also help with if people are experiencing, say, for example, performance issues, to work out if it's the customized part of the code or Alfresco code itself. So a sort of a caveat or disclaimer is that if you're not confident or if in doubt, then you should start with the public APIs. These are well defined, they're supported, option to use on-premise and in the cloud. And you might start, if you're new to Alfresco, with CMIS 1.1 and the extra RESTful extensions. And we have a number of SDKs in terms of there have been other sessions at the summit around the new Alfresco 2.0 SDK. So if you're using Java and Maven, you might start with SDK. And there's the mobile SDK, which also allows you to build and customize the applications on iOS and Android. So that's really, if you're not sure, then start there. But also, if you are then customizing further, whether you're doing it at scripting level, using, say, for example, JavaScript, or going deeper, then you may be interested in some of the more foundational services of Alfresco. So if you are writing repo extensions and package them as an AMP, for example, you might be looking at the web scripts, and you could do a JavaScript-based web script, but you might actually be interested in looking also Java-backed web scripts, possibly building new services in the style of our overall framework. Or you might be customizing the models and adding things like policies and some behavior around those models. And it's something I've talked about in previous summits and DevCons. So as we start to sort of dive in to the repository, if we just start with a quick overview, I've put an onion here. The idea is to kind of slice and dice and maybe peel away some of the layers of the repository. I've borrowed, this is quite an old diagram, I think, from either the wiki or the Alfresco docs, and I've put a few boxes above it. The repository itself, if you imagine you're using some of the APIs that we mentioned, and you have effectively clients, repository clients, against that repository. And you may start at the top building web applications, mobile apps. I've put desktop apps as well. For example, you may want to build a complete native desktop app, or desktop sync would be an example. And below, with the web applications, obviously people are probably familiar with Share, using the mobile SDK for mobile-based apps, and some things I've already mentioned in terms of web scripts and CMIS, sync services for hybrid sync, and then potentially for forthcoming desktop sync. And protocols, we support lots of protocols, I'll mention that in a moment, and also our newer Alfresco Office services that you may have heard mentioned in terms of SharePoint protocol and Office editing. So lower down in that diagram, some of you might have seen this before from some time back, we use Spring as a framework to bind a whole raft of lower-level services. And those services are bound in various ways. And the idea was that, as I said earlier, we didn't want to limit how people might use those. So in theory, although maybe not in practice, you might have the option to potentially interchange some of the implementations. So some of those were based in terms of component implementations, and you would potentially swap out some services. And one example would have been the version service. In theory, you could have added in a different versioning implementation, but in practice, that's quite coarse, so it's maybe not easier said than done. Another way of looking at the repo, and I realize there's a lot of small words here, and you probably can't see them from the back, but hopefully once we've uploaded the slides, you can have access to this as a reference. The repository, again, there's the APIs at the top, the protocols. I've put a whole list there: WebDAV, SharePoint Protocol, IMAP, FTP, CIFS, SMTP, LDAP. And then coming down, the Alfresco repository is structured in terms of subsystems, and those subsystems kind of map onto effectively child application contexts of Spring. And it's a kind of a sort of an attempt at modularizing parts of the repo where you can enable and disable some parts of the subsystem. I've thrown in some transactions and security, content models and behaviors. I won't spend any time really talking about modeling or behaviors today as we go down. And then the next two boxes are just kind of a little bit arbitrary, but they're kind of covering, and I'll show some more services in a minute, kind of an overall term of collaborative services, which might be things like the activities, the social graph, the subscriptions for people following each other, discussion threads, commenting, that kind of thing. And then there's lower core foundation services that we'll get onto a bit further on. And on this diagram, I haven't even shown sort of the control services or the process services, such as the workflow service, etc. And Alfresco the repository sits on a whole raft of third-party libraries and frameworks, and I've already mentioned Spring Framework, Spring Security. We use MyBatis for providing a SQL mapping layer to JDBC. In the past, we used to use Hibernate, and then we switched over to iBatis and now MyBatis, and I'll mention that a bit later on. And there's obviously things like Solar, which then sits on top of Lucene. And in terms of the enterprise support, we also provide clustered caches, which are implemented using Hazelcast. So just an example of some of the frameworks and libraries that we sit on top of. In terms of storage, we have the relational SQL store for the storing mostly the context and metadata, among other things. The content object store for the binary files itself, which could be a shared file system or S3 or any other shared file system. And the search storage mechanism, which is effectively the Lucene indexes. So just a quick overview that some of you may be already aware of. So as we dive in, how are we doing for time? As I mentioned, there's a lot of services, and I'm not expecting everybody to read this diagram. What I've tried to do is put them all, well, not all of them, put a lot of the core services on, so some of them, and I've just dropped the word service off them, but this does map onto the Java services that are in the repository. So a lot of them is like the site, for example, there's a site service, there's a rule service, action service. There's a whole example, and I'm going to kind of drill down, and a lot of these are going to fall away as we go down, importing and exporting service as categories. So some of this is the collaborative services at the top, quick share, the public sharing service. So you can refer to this later on, and I think part of the idea of this talk was hopefully, if you do get a chance, I'll hopefully give some pointers, and obviously if you're interested in particular services or aspects of the repository, you can find me later on, we can talk about those. The colors don't really mean much, but at the further down, there's one of the key services is a file folder service, which maps onto the container relationship against, sort of wraps around the nodes and version service. So the more foundational service near the bottom there are things like the node service that people may be aware of, the version service, content service, etc. So there's lots of them there, and I'm trying to put them all on there just to give you an idea of the breadth. So, I mean, how would you start if you're relatively new and you want to dive in a bit deeper? With the new Maven SDK, or otherwise if you just check out head off of the community version out of Subversion, you can now use whichever IDE you use, but in this example Eclipse, you can pull in the top level POM, and it will pull in lots of artifacts, lots of projects. So what I've done is just selected a small subset. These are more the repository level artifacts, and there's an example here I've just put on the left there, remote API, which I'm going to leave for now, which is CMIS and the web script level. There's a thing called a repository project or artifact. There's also a data model, and there's a one called core, which is probably slightly misnamed. It's more of a utility. It's a very small artifact, that one, but I wouldn't confuse that with the repository core. But one of the things, and probably one of the issues with this, is the repository artifact is actually still quite large. There's a lot of things in there. But there's an example of the listing of that subset. Oops, excuse me. So if you want to start looking at how this is structured, especially at a code level, you can look at, for example, the service registry, which has traditionally a list of what we might term public Java-level services. So you can have a look at that, and there's also a corresponding Spring configuration file. We still, for traditional historic reasons, we use XML-based configuration of Spring, which has a public services context file which also kind of maps closely to the service registry. And that gives a list of some of those services I showed you earlier. And there's a lot of Spring configuration files, and one of the tricky things is to understand how they all wire together. So this will hopefully give you a few pointers where to look. But those are, as I mentioned, if you look at those service registries, you see those listed. If you look at the context files, and then try and build up a picture of how they're all wired together. Some of the kind of core foundational services that some of you may come across are the node service itself, which maps nodes and metadata properties, aspects, the content service that maps onto the content stores, and the search service. And given the time constraints, I'm not going to talk about search today. I know there'll be other talks about Solar 4 with Alfresco 5. So we're going to kind of drop away the search service for now. I'm sure lots of people are interested in that part, and focus more around the node service and below and how it's structured. So just as an example of the Spring config, you can look it up later, I know you won't be able to read it, but if you looked at one of the files, in the example, just a tiny snippet, I chose the core context file. There's the checkout check-in service for checkout and check-in, and it pulls in various bindings, including the version service, the rule service, etc. And I highlighted the file folder service that I mentioned earlier. And if you then look down into another context file, there's a model that's called the model specific services context file. There's the file folder service defined, which then again pulls in some of the foundational services. And if you look through all those and you try and map, you can actually debug Spring and see all the beans. There's a lot of beans. So there's a lot of things that get pulled in if you start the whole repository context. One thing I'll skim over, I mentioned earlier, is the content models, but you can look those up if you're interested. And you could start at the content, the kind of core content model. But there's also underpinning that is the dictionary model that has the data types. And there's a whole other list of models you can look up. I've just put starmodel.xml. In terms of security and permissions, there's a couple other context files. Well, the first one is a context file, the public services security.xml, and then the permission definitions. And if you read through those carefully, you can sort of see how it's built up in terms of the security at the method level for the Java services. And as we drill down deeper, we look at the database level. We have what we call data access objects, DAOs, and they're in a package called org.alfresco.repo.domain. And they're very consistently built. So once you've looked at one and understood how one works, it should become relatively easy to see how the others work. Hopefully that area is very consistent in terms of the interfaces and the implementations. And as I mentioned, we use MyBatis as a SQL mapper, which we've fully supported since 3.2x. We used MyBatis earlier on for some experimentation work with activity service. But then we moved fully over, I think it was 3.2. And MyBatis is also used by the activity project. And that allows us to be DB agnostic. So a lot of the SQL that we map is common ANSI SQL, but we also extended MyBatis with an extension to what's called the config builder, and it allows us to write, where we need it, dialect-specific SQL across the DB types that we support. And again, there's a lot there, but if you look at the SQL map files, you can see how those DMLs, the select, insert, update, delete, how they're structured. And we have, in terms of querying, we have another little, which I haven't even mentioned on these slides, there's another area around what we call canned queries, which we use when we split Solr out from the embedded Lucene out to a Solr server. Some things in terms of Alfresco depended on the embedded Lucene, and we wanted that to allow us to use Solr as a separate service or server. So we have a thing called canned queries that allows us to write certain queries directly down. So that's another area you could look at. There's a class called domain test suite that pulls in all the DAO unit tests. So if you look at that domain test suite, or you can just run it. If you just start Eclipse and run that, you'll see it run through. It runs through quite quickly. And you can see how those DAOs are structured in terms of the unit tests. As I mentioned, we're DB agnostic, so we support many DB types. In terms of enterprise, it's Oracle, DB2, SQL Server, as well as MySQL and Postgres. And I think it was at last summit, people were asking about MariaDB, and I think we've now, in September, announced that we also support MariaDB, I think from Enterprise 4.2.3. And it's effectively a drop-in replacement for MySQL, but I think that was part of the questions from last year. In terms of community, there's MySQL, MariaDB, and Postgres. And optionally, for development and testing, you might choose to use H2 if you're using it in sort of development mode. And I think the Maven SDK uses H2 as well as activity for sort of local dev tests. So that's another option if you decided not to use MySQL or Postgres, or if you're just running kind of embedded unit tests. Now, I think when Richard sort of helped me to write up the abstract, he said people were interested in database tables. Normally, you wouldn't access the database tables directly. You'd go through the high-level services. But if you were maybe potentially you wanted to write some additional information into the Alfresco, your own custom tables, but build upon them in the same style that we do, it might be useful to know some of the tables. So what I tried to do is just a quick logical diagram. I've just shown the Alf schema. We also have the ACT for activity schema that gets embedded by activity. JVPM as an option, and I think as of Alfresco 5.0, we no longer have the AVM tables because they were obsoleted. But if you're running a 4. Instance, you may still see the AVM tables empty. So I've just shown just a selection of the Alf tables. These will map onto alf_store, for example. So if you look at the structure of the Alfresco repository is built into sort of logical stores. And one of the ones you might be most familiar with is what's called the spaces store, which holds the workspaces, and it's the one you might be familiar with if you go through share and use sites and you go through the .lib. You'd go through the spaces store. But otherwise, there's other stores, such as the archive store, which if you're deleting things, it's like the trash can. So things will go into the archive store first, and then you have the option to purge and empty those, or have the option to restore back. And another example of a store is the version store, where you keep the versioning kind of logically separate from the live loads in the workspaces store. And the store, I've drawn the arrows represent foreign keys, just to give you a flavor of how the database is structured. So the store does point back to the node for the initial root node of the hierarchy. And then every node belongs back to the store. And that hierarchy is defined by child associations, which are parent-child. So as you build up the hierarchy, you see them connected through. There's also the option to have sort of peer associations, where two nodes can just reference each other in terms of a node association. So there's a source and a target. So the other things you may be familiar with in terms of if you're looking at the modeling is the properties and the aspects. I've also thrown on, and those are defined in terms of the dictionary model, in terms of Q names and their namespace. So I just want to give a little flavor of some of the internals. The content data is, I put a dotted line. There's not actually a foreign key between the node property to content data, but there's a special, in terms of the model, there's a content property which effectively references that content data. And then the content data has URLs to the underlying content store. So I just wanted to call that out as well. So one way to, if you want to get deeper and deeper, is you could reverse engineer the whole schema using a DB schema reverse engineering tool, and then kind of map out and see how it's structured, obviously, or look at the SQL map files to see how they're used. And so for convenience, I've done one for you. So if you get the presentation, you can download it if you're interested as an image. And this, I just used the MySQL Workbench and tried to just kind of lay it out a little bit. So there's a whole area on the right here, which you won't be able to see right now, but you can look at it later in the presentation, around ACLs, access control lists, and the control entries, how they map to permissions and authorities. So as you look at, say, for example, the DAOs or the services above, if you're interested, you could see how they map down to these tables. There's a whole area on the right here, which is all around audit and what we call prop values, which is a different way of storing properties. They're not node properties, but it's a little bit like a key value store, and it allows us to do highly indexed auditing, and also it's used a lot for things which I think was mentioned in one of the earlier slides, a thing called attribute service that allows you to retrieve values through direct indexes, either just a single key or a three-level key. And so that's implemented in terms of these prop values. So that was a kind of a deep dive down to the database, but if we have time, so we're finishing at past, isn't it? So I wanted to just give an overview of microservices, but obviously if you have any questions about that, we can come back to at the end. So microservices is a kind of a thing that's been talked about over the last few years as a sort of a style of architecture. And a very quick overview. I'm not here to sort of promote or demote microservices. I think there's various benefits and drawbacks, but if you've come, I don't know how many people are interested in microservices, have come across them. Just one person, so I won't spend too long, a couple of people, okay. But the idea is, as an architectural style, I mean, if you think, I just showed you all those services in Alfresco, and I won't really want to use the word monolithic, but obviously if you build the full Alfresco out of the box, the Alfresco WAR is about 150 meg. It's quite a large thing, and obviously those are all kind of interrelated, and they're layered and running effectively in a single process. The idea here is that you can potentially build up a suite of smaller, and obviously the word micro is debatable how big or small a microservice might be, but the theory is that you can build up the smaller, independently deployable services. And the idea is they're simpler and specific and hopefully do one thing well, although that's easier said than done. But the idea is if they are then independently deployable and they communicate and distributed, then they're, in theory, more loosely coupled. And also, so hopefully those services then collaborate through some lightweight communication. Typically, people start with HTTP and JSON, but you're not limited to using those. You might have a binary protocol if you're very specialized. But by being loosely coupled and by doing one thing well, in theory, also the data that they kind of work with is kind of by definition also distributed to some extent. because their function is to look after their own data store. So you may have some data in the SQL store. Obviously, we talked about the search service. The search service is using Solr, and you've seen it. It's using its own index store. So a lot of this is about what do we mean by the size of a microservice and how it might interact. So in theory, they could be, I've just wrote here, independently developed. In theory, deployed, scaled, managed. And in theory, again, teams, there may be, if you have a wider organization, you may have teams that specialize in those particular services. And they may even be written in different languages or on a different stack and use potentially different protocols to communicate. But there are benefits and drawbacks, and in some ways it's a spectrum. And a lot of these things on this slide would apply to any kind of service, just an Alfresco service as it stands now, whether you're doing continuous integration, if you're doing extensions or customizing, continuous QA. If you are deploying an online service, then there's a certain amount of, depending on how often you wish to upgrade and deploy. Some organizations deploy on a daily basis. And if you think of our Alfresco cloud, we don't deploy on a daily basis, but we theoretically deploy more often. And I think some people in the marketing talk about the speed of SaaS. So the idea is that some of the, whether you're using a microservice or not, the idea is to encourage a more modular structure. And by those things communicating, and it's true whether it's out of process or in process, to think about effectively those APIs at whatever level you're at. And so those API contracts do have a benefit to think about, but also the drawback or the thing you need to consider is as you evolve those services, you need to think about how those effectively internal APIs are versioned. But it does mean there's more moving parts. Potentially these services are collaborating, so there's more network hops, and there's other considerations like latency. So that's just a quick overview. But you might think the repository is now, and the way we know it is, I've drawn again here the boxes, the remote APIs, there's the core repository services. But we have the option to break out things. And I mentioned earlier, we don't necessarily limit people how they use the repository. There may be some limitations to how you get supported through enterprise support. But in terms of customizing Alfresco, you can do whatever you need to do if you're confident and creative in doing those things. So one of the things is in terms of our internal kind of search service, in the past we've broken out search into a separate Solr server. And that, whether you consider that a microservice or not, you're running that independently, and you should be able to scale that to some extent. You might break out transformations and renditioning, because that's CPU intensive, into a separate transformation or renditioning server. And as an example, I've just put in dotted here, you might decide actually in terms of process-based apps, you might wish to also break out the process engine into its own server and then communicate from the repository to those different independently running services. As an example, if you're building using Java Stack, you might use, as I mentioned earlier, HTTP and JSON. You might decide that those internal services communicate with a RESTful API. If you're using Alfresco, you might, because you like web scripts, you might use web scripts, but you're not limited. If you decide you want to do something different, you could use JAX-RS, which is a sort of standard for RESTful web services. And what you might do is I've mentioned right at the beginning of the slides around content and context, you might focus on a very subset of the repository, and you're interested in manipulating using nodes and metadata and that kind of thing. So if you then run that, rather than having a very large wall, you may have a smaller component. And one way of packaging that is to use some of these frameworks. An example would be something like DropWizard, which came from Yammer originally, a chap called, I think, CodaHale. And he also has a complementary library called Metrics. And those are effectively, another example would be Spring Boot from the Spring team. And these are kind of opinionated stacks that would choose to sort of have inbuilt or by default service or functions that you may wish to use. So the example I gave here is for DropWizard. It's opinionated. It just uses Jetty embedded, Jersey for JAX-RS, and Jackson for the JSON manipulation. Spring Boot using MVC and the framework is similar. And it might use Tomcat by default, but if you're using Jetty, you can welcome to use Jetty. Again, it uses Jackson, for example, for JSON. And it also has a metrics adapter. And if you're using CodaHale metrics here, you can put that into the Spring Boot setup. So then you can start that smaller service in your IDE or just off the command line. You don't have to necessarily deploy to the container. It just has the container embedded. So as an example, I took, this is the Hello World example of the repository core, which is, I put a snapshot of the console. It's running the Alfresco core, but not with web scripts. It's running it in DropWizard, and it starts up here with the metrics. And I've just put one API on it, which is the Hello World repository, which is to list the stores and the root nodes of those stores, which is the output here. And that's running in Drop Wizard. You could wrap it potentially in Spring Boot would be another way of doing it. And a Hello World 2 might be the sort of canonical example, which is a repository node browser, which again in this case is read-only. Thank you. And you might then not only get the store routes, you may then navigate down the nodes, look at the child nodes, look at the, you could have a section, I'm not sure it's shown on here, but you could have a section to show source and targets for peer association, show the properties. And this one happened to be written in Angular as a client against that sort of embedded repository. So I just want to show there's various ways you could wrap the core underlying foundation services. In terms of microservices, you are interested in that. There's various articles out on the web. But I would, if you are interested, if you haven't seen this before, have a look at a couple of these. But you notice one of the ones in here, I think it says, it's not a free lunch. And I think if you haven't seen it before, it's also worth having a look at some of the comments attached to those articles, because people have a debate about what are the pros and cons of using this kind of architecture style. So bearing in mind the deep dive of the repository, looking at a little bit around the microservice style and breaking out components that can be then independently scaled, various people have been talking about so-called smart process apps, or what are being called intelligent process apps. And here's just an example, taking some of those things, bearing some of those things in mind. Well, actually, before I start, I should say, that the idea of smart process apps was a term that was coined by Forrester. And the idea is those apps are process-centric, task-based, maybe more collaborative and social. That's to be discussed. But they typically are involved around case management, or adaptable case management, or dynamic case management, I guess, from what I was hearing from John. He prefers the idea of active folders or smart folders, although we have used the term smart folders a long time ago before. And again, I think on one of my early slides, I mentioned the idea of context and control, content, obviously, and control, which in this case I mean by control is process. These smart process apps should be hopefully highly configurable. If they're running in the cloud, they should be on a per tenant basis, but at least on a per application, deployed application basis. And obviously, being Alfresco, they should be simple and smart or intelligent. And putting all those things together, when I showed all those services broken out, here might be one way of looking at it. And again, I'm not sure how well you can see it from the back, but you have a number of applications running in this kind of middle tier that are running directly against effectively the public API is here. And what I've written there is just a sort of what I call loosely a case API or case services. In particular, as an example, case and case review, the idea of reviewing case review services, which include process functions. And those sit on terms of these sort of smaller services, including content and metadata, which you might think of the core repo that I've just been talking about, but also transformations broken out, workflow or process, and that would be driven by the activity engine, search and index queries, either through Solr or something like Elasticsearch. And these applications are defined in terms of a config, and there's other things like around identity management, and those sit down on top of their stores. And I mentioned earlier that the data, if you've got these services that are dedicated to certain functions, they may have different data stores. So obviously, we have content and the metadata, the repo running against the traditional sort of SQL-based metadata store, the content storage for files, activity having its own schema, search indexes that I mentioned, but also potentially other stores, whether SQL-based or even no SQL-based, for storing some of the other information for other parts of the overall running service. But one of the disadvantages, obviously, there's a lot more moving parts. You're now dealing potentially with 5 or 6 different types of services that need to be independently scaled. So there's some amount of automation to keep that and monitoring to make sure that's all running as a single system. And an example that you may have seen in the keynote or on the expert bar is this example is a contract management lifecycle or contract lifecycle management app showing some of these concepts in terms of task-based or a smart process app. I haven't drawn some of the other screens around review, and this is running live now. If you didn't get a chance, I'm sure there's probably still time to see a demo if you're interested. So a very quick recap. I've talked about the repository at a very high-level overview, dived in a little bit deeper all the way down to the database tables, talked a little about how you might just use parts of that, and if you peel away the layers and choose which areas you're interested in, or take the whole thing and maybe just run it in different ways in terms of sort of a services architecture so you can scale independent parts. and shown an example of a sort of a smart process app built from that kind of theory. At the end of the slides, I've put some further details in terms of SVN and other areas. I just wanted to say thank you very much. And Felix did jump, and I think it took him about 4 minutes of free fall and about 9 minutes before he hit the ground a couple of years ago. So, thanks very much.